If you're trying to do an ethics but you have no notion of justice behind it, you might just have a bad notion of justice.
Socially, politically, ethically, personally, how do you shift? Yo! Welcome to Owls at Dawn. We are just two dudes from Southern California who studied philosophy, politics, and religion around the world and decided to start a podcast where we could bullshit with impunity. I am a rejuvenated Austin Hayden Smith.
And I'm Troy Polidori, and I want to say we should change it so we are still two dudes.
Yeah.
Quantification.
We are we were almost one dude from Southern California for a little bit there. Oh, gosh. Yes, it's good to be back. It's good to be back. Sorry to people who out there are used to a weekly episode, but I had a little medical emergency that struck me randomly on a Friday morning about almost a month ago now. So had to go to the hospital and take care of a collapsed lung, and then it wasn't repairing itself, and it's called a tension pneumothorax, so it's putting pressure on my heart. So they rush you in immediately and do all this shit. And we'll talk about this more in a bonus episode that we're actually going to release in conjunction with this episode. But then I ended up having to have lung surgery where they cut out a couple pieces of my lung, stapled me back up, and do something called a pleurodesis, where they basically scuff up your lung, slap some talc on there, creates a chemical reaction with this viscous liquid in your pleural space, and it kind of creates like a cement bond and attaches your lung back to your chest lining, so it can't happen again. And then, like I said, they had to cut out two problem areas on my lung. They have these things called blebs on your lungs that can form, that when they burst, they create a leak in that pleural space region that disrupts the pressure and basically makes your lung collapse. And so they cut out a couple of bad areas and then staple them back up. It's called a wedge resection. And then they send you out the door a week after they perform the surgery, and then you recover. So I'm back, though.
But that's just a tease. We're going to save the rest for a bonus ep.
That's right.
A really sexy description, after dark, sexy description of surgery and recovery.
And the hallucinogenic spiritual journey that I went on when they gave me ketamine when I first went into the emergency room, and they performed the initial procedure, which is called a chest drain, and they gave me ketamine. And just for people listening, I have seen God, and she's beautiful.
I've been waiting with bated breath to hear about your K-hole story.
So we'll get into that. I know.
You're going to hear me eating popcorn during the bonus ep, if you listen.
It's going to be like that Michael Jackson gif where he's sitting there eating popcorn in the movie theater. That meme. Like, I'm ready. Okay, cool, man. Well, what do we have to do first? I guess we'll give a shout out to our sponsors over at Mubi. Yeah? We haven't done an episode for a while, so we want to make sure that we give credit to where credit is due, because they really help us be able to make this podcast possible. And I've said this before, and I'm not bullshitting. Like, I reached out to Mubi because I use Mubi. I love Mubi. It is an online streaming service. It's MUBI, by the way. It's an online streaming service that is very unique. They specialize in indie darlings, art house favorites, regional specialties, classics of cinema from all around the world. And they have a 30-day rotation that a film will come in and it lives for 30 days, and then it falls off at the end, which means that 30 films for 30 days, a new film every day, and then that means a film drops off after a 30-day rotation. So there's a fresh rotation, then it also creates a nice little sense of urgency, and it's not too many films that you can't manage either. It's not like 1,000 films and you're like, oh no, a film's going to drop off and I don't have time to see the 10 that I want to see this month. You generally will be able to see either ones that you've wanted to see or new films that kind of just come out of nowhere that take your interest within the allotted framework and the kind of situations of exigency that they create for you. So it's absolutely fantastic, and they're offering a 30-day free extended free trial for Owls at Dawn listeners. So if you go to mubi.com/owlsatdawn, you can take advantage of that. That's mubi.com/owlsatdawn, and you can get your free trial. And Troy's going to talk to you about a film that is in his library, because they do have different regional libraries depending on where you are in the world, but one that has caught his attention that he wants to tell you about.
Yeah, so the one in my library that I was immediately struck by is a movie called Starred Up by David Mackenzie. I believe he's a British director, right? Mm-hmm. And it's a kind of classic prison drama starring Jack O'Connell, who I know you're a fan of, from what's the show?
Skins.
Yeah, I never watched that. What was his deal in Skins?
Well, so because you know how they have a revolving rotation of their casts in Skins, and I believe it was season 3, 4, 5 that he was in, and it's also Effie. If what is the actor's name? I can see her face. She was in like Maze Runner, and she was in I think it was the remake of, was it Pride and Prejudice? Oh gosh, I can't remember. But I can see her face. I think she might have like an interesting Englishy name, like with like a Celtic background or some shit. Anyway,
but she was in Skins with Jack O'Connell.
She's in Skins. Yeah, and so it was Jack O'Connell, it was the character Effie, and then Freddie, and it's this trio. They were like the main three, and I don't want to say too much without ruining what happens, but the way that the season, or the way that their stint culminates is just so fantastic, and that's when I kind of got my man crush on Jack O'Connell. So when I found out that he was going to be in Startup, I was like, yes, I love this guy, and so I was impressed.
Yeah, it's a commanding performance too. He plays like a teenage kind of thug who is put in prison and tries to kind of dominate and become, sort of a leader in prison, someone who can't be taken advantage of. And he ends up finding out that his father, his long lost father, played by Ben Mendelsohn, who's fantastic, or was fantastic.
Whom I also
fantastic
love.
Before he started being in like superhero movies, at least.
Yes. He's amazing in everything he does,
except for the superhero movies.
I mean, I'll give him a pass.
Yeah, that's kind of like going to the park and shooting hoops. Like, you don't have to play fundamental basketball when you're at the park, right?
he's playing a horse. He's just doing trick shots.
Yeah, he's doing trick shots, exactly. So it's cool if you shoot threes from behind the hoop and stuff like that. Right. It's like, yeah, what the fuck? Who cares? You can be high when
definitely
you're playing
not
the park. You don't have to take it seriously.
That's right. This is not that kind of performance by Ben Mendelsohn.
No, not at all.
Yeah.
I don't want to say too much about it because it's better just to watch, but it's quite the commanding emotional performances by the two of them, and definitely a movie worth watching. It's not one of those 3-hour long prison dramas that just beats you into a pulp and tells you that everything is wrong with the world and everything sucks and you should die. Although it is definitely dark. So absolutely recommend David Mackenzie's Startup.
Sick. Sounds good. So yeah, so go check out your regional library, see what you've got available, and then sign up for your free trial, mubi.com/owlsatdawn. Yeah.
We also want to say, if you want to support us in more tangible ways, you can join our Patreon at patreon.com/owlsatdawn. We have several tiers of support from which you can contribute towards and get extra goodies like the bonus ep where Austin's going to describe his incredible, transcendental K-hole experience, which by itself is probably worth the price of admission. But then you also get access to stuff like the monthly newsletter, which we release every month with extra sticky leaves, extra shitty minutes, extra bullshit that you definitely want more of, as well as the ability to contribute towards choosing our next patron-sponsored episode.
That is right, and I know I said this last month, but I hope you guys will give me a little bit of a pass just because I was laid up a little bit and I am so behind on so many things. But the newsletter for September is just a little bit behind, as was the newsletter for August, which came out, I think, like the first week of September. So the September newsletter will be coming out in the next couple of days. So it might be released by the time this episode is out, but it will definitely be within a couple of days after the release of this episode. So check your inboxes for that. And then, of course, if you want access to that, go to patreon.com/owlsatdawn.
Yeah.
Sweet! Well, let's get into the shitty minute. This is the segment of the episode where one of us gets to rant and rave about whatever it is that is chapping our hide. So, Troy, it's been a while. You're in a new city. Things are different. Is there anything that you want to complain about?
Well, there's definitely something I want to complain about, but it's not about where I live or anything like that, man.
Okay.
I always go more abstract, man. Nothing concrete in this shitty minute.
True.
So I know you've been laid up, but did you have a chance to watch the kind of now infamous Chappelle stand-up special on Netflix?
I watched the first 10 minutes.
Why? Explain.
It was no principled reason. I mean, maybe I'm just tired of the culture war, and I feel like Bill Burr just released a comedy special where he's complaining about the culture war. Chappelle did, Aziz Ansari did his one. Everybody on Twitter is constantly doing it on either side of the aisle, and I'm kind of just exhausted by it. And I swear, guys, I'm not just going to talk about my surgery as though it's like the only thing that matters, and it has somehow like removed the scales from my eyes, and like I'm going to change my name and become a fucking Sherpa. But
it has, and you will.
But it has, yeah. And I have been just I have had no patience for that kind of thing, and so I watched the first 10 minutes, and I chuckled a couple of times. I did the a couple of times, and then I also did a couple of like mental eye rolls a few times, but that wasn't really it. It was more just that I didn't have the mental space for anything intellectual or provocative or stimulating beyond just simple pleasures while I was recovering, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I totally get that. And I think that My Shitty Minute's kind of almost like a transcendental argument in virtue of that phenomenon, in the sense that I watched the Chappelle stand up, and he's one of the greatest comedians of our generation, if not probably the greatest comedian of our generation. So anytime he's got a new special up, you definitely want to get onto it right away. And it's for sure going to be into the social media sphere. Not that I give two shits about that, but it's a reason to sort of watch it before you hear everything about it.
Right.
And it just, I think there's a lot of uproar about it from the left, that there's some points that I think are accurate and some that are totally inaccurate or basically just looking for, the outrage machine. But I don't really give a shit. And really what bugs me about the whole thing is just the idea that we have to take comedians seriously now.
Yes.
Is that's basically just an assumed premise in the way we treat anytime one of the big comedians comes out with a new special. I remember Aziz Ansari's special from earlier this year, and it was awful. I thought it was just terrible. I don't think I finished it because I just thought it was so bad. And I usually like Aziz Ansari a lot, especially when he's doing like writing and stuff. Maybe not stand up, but we sort of have to take everything so seriously now with the big comedians that we end up. And I don't want to say that comedians can't err for this reason. Of course they can, but we end up treating the medium as if it's basically a speech, right? Like an expressive speech. And in one case, that does treat the comedian unfairly because that's not what they're actually trying to do. But it also just sucks. Like, who would want to listen to like some rando who's probably not all that educated usually just speak for an hour and a half and just opine on random subjects without any real through line oftentimes? That's just not interesting. Why would you do that? And so there's something about comedians that they seem to have gained a new sort of social position in the last, 10 or 20 years, where they're almost like the go-to public intellectuals. So when you have a new phenomenon that exists in the culture, something that's a little bit ambiguous, such as like social norms, you have to go to the big comedians to get their say because they're the ones who are going to opine on it and have the expertise on it, right? They're kind of like the sophists of the day in that sense. And that's just like, if your society exists in that way, and not necessarily by choice, but just sort of that's how it ended up being the case, something is like desperately wrong with the like intellectual sphere of that society. If the comedians are the go-to public intellectuals. And I don't want to do like a long diatribe about why that's the case because I'm not entirely sure. It's got something to do with the fact that no one trusts academics and actual intellectuals anymore. And also something to do with like the isolation of academics as well, I think. But even beyond that.
And the valorization of celebrity culture.
Yeah, definitely that's part of it. Although I don't think that people take what Kanye says as seriously as they take what a comedian says. Or at least in the same way. But that's neither here nor there. There's something special about comedians where they kind of occupy both the celebrity aspect and the quote unquote intellectual aspect. And that's just like sad and wrong and terrible, and nothing good will come of that. And it will ruin comedy. Also, it'll make comedy no longer funny, no longer challenging, or interesting in any important way. So I just want to say, like, we gotta stop valorizing comedians in the first place. Whether or not what they sometimes do is wrong or right, or what the norms are regarding making people angry and using terminology that goes against social norms or whatever. We got to stop treating it so seriously. It's not that serious.
It's so funny. You just said something that triggered a thought. there's a great irony in all of this. The comedians are being thrust into the limelight and placed on a pedestal, and almost like there's a demand imposed upon them that we hear them speak. But simultaneously, when they speak, they're speaking about the pressures that are imposed upon them by being thrust into the limelight based on what they perceive as being like PC culture, or how like they're not allowed to attack on free speech or something like that. So the great irony here is right in that tension, right? That tension point where they're getting the thing that maybe allows them to have the platform so that they can continue to speak, but then they're complaining that they can't say what they want to say. And so there is this weird tension going on there.
But there's no sense in which they're really grasping or diagnosing the underlying problem, which is that they shouldn't have this platform in the first place, right?
Exactly.
Something is desperately sick and wrong with society such that they're given this platform or this level of importance. And maybe that's just a blind spot because they wouldn't be making as much money if that were the case.
Right.
I don't know. But I feel like, there was some sense in which Chris Rock and George Carlin and others had an important role to play, but it wasn't quite as central as comedians play now. And maybe Chris Rock and George Carlin are partly responsible for everyone needing to be just like them now.
So I have a theory, and I don't know how far I want to take this, but I've been thinking about this a lot lately. There are a lot of people that bemoan the sort of like fall of the public intellectual, or the kind of public display of respect towards intellectual elites or something like that, and that that we're like amusing ourselves to death in Postman's term, and that we've turned towards like a sort of vulgarized celebrity, superficial consumerist culture, whatever, blah blah blah. But what I wonder is like there's something where I think comedy and philosophy actually are interesting bedfellows. Like, not that they're the same thing, but I wonder if like historically comedians, like, yeah, they had a relative universal appeal, like somebody like an Eddie Murphy whose specials were huge, right? Or like somebody like a Richard Pryor. But nevertheless, there was still the safety of the comedy room that wasn't recorded, where you could work out material, say stupid shit, say really crazy. Like, you would go see a comedian in the 90s, 80s, 70s, and you would be like, what the fuck? Part of it was that you're seeing something that was taboo, right? I mean, that's why comedians historically have been jailed, ostracized. You see Sam Kinison screaming on late night television. That's like this great scandal, because that's coming out of the comedy room into the universal almost, right? Into the public. But there's something safe and radical and interesting about the taboo of the comedy room. Similar with, I think, philosophy. When philosophy tries to be too public, when it tries to come out of not the classroom or the ivory tower, I don't mean that, but out of the space where it's allowed to just completely confront and experiment and be taboo and exist on the margins and as a fringe discourse or as a fringe place in the world. I think there's something kind of interesting going on to think about the difference between those two, because when it comes out of that, it almost kind of corrupts what it's able to do. And I'm not even sure that philosophy, at least some types of philosophy, I'm not sure that philosophy in terms of like questioning and thinking and examining and critical reasoning, but I mean more like certain like radical philosophical orientations that they almost belong on the margins or the fringes. They can't be part of the status quo. They're like essentially organized contra the status quo.
Yeah, I think that's certainly true, and I think that my point is not to say something like we need to bring back public intellectuals in the same way they existed before, but that there's a sense in which sort of moral authorities have disappeared. In large part because I think people just don't have anyone they are willing to invest that authority in from the usual spaces, and comedians have almost taken up some of that space. Not all of it, because that general distrust is probably like 80% still there. But we need to diagnose that problem, and the answer is probably not just go back to blindly trusting moral authorities, but it's got to be something other than invest part of it in comedians, because that's definitely not better and probably worse than the opposite. And maybe even worse than just having no public moral authorities at all.
And it is stupid when like Bill Burr or Dave Chappelle or Aziz Ansari, because they're talking about these culture war issues, are somehow viewed as being radical. Like, oh, like they're standing up for free speech, like these crazy radical, like the fact that is even considered a scandal to me is so odd.
Yeah, my
right?
God,
because
it's so stupid. Like being booed is being censored.
You're right. Right. And then 1,000 YouTube videos about so-and-so destroys the SJWs or so-and-so destroys the conservatives. It's like, no one's destroying anybody. They're all in the center, okay? The fucking extreme center. They're all just circling around each other. Very safe. Oh, God. Yeah. Did you watch the whole special?
Yeah, I did.
And, I mean, like, I only watched 10 minutes of it, and then I read some of the outrage, but like I said, I didn't have too much patience for that madness. Does he say anything like truly provocative and crazy and wild, or is it him kind of touching these sensitive subjects? And then you're kind of like, oh, I get it already. Nothing he's saying isn't something I haven't seen engaged with already on Twitter.
No, I mean, it's nothing truly new, and it's Chappelle, so he's got his own style, which I think is much deeper and more nuanced than the usual comedians, especially ones that address kind of culture war issues. And some of the jokes kind of fell flat, and I think were kind of mean, but I don't really give a shit. But then some of the jokes I thought were actually pretty funny. He had a whole series where he talked about, which was I think probably the most provocative part of the whole thing, where he talked about LGBTQ people and the different resentments they might have intra group, like amongst each other. And I thought that was actually pretty funny because it kind of came from a place of care, like an assumption that, well, these people are all in this like weird conglomeration together, which they don't necessarily have to be in. And there are some people who don't like the others in that group for various reasons, which is true. And sometimes we kind of gloss over that when we just combine them all in one acronym. And I think that kind of came from a place of, telling jokes and making fun, but also from a place of, this is only funny if you think these people are kind of right. It's kind of getting at sort of the weird contradictions within a basically correct position. And so that was, I think, the part where it actually was pretty good and pretty interesting. Other parts, not so much, but that's comedy. Just kind of, it's one guy who's actually really good at comedy, probably the best one that there is in America during this generation. Just have a listen to what he has to say, and some of it's not going to be good because he's not a genius, and other parts of it might be kind of interesting. And then, let it go. That's kind of how I think we treated like Chris Rock and George Carlin, Richard Pryor. So treat the new guys the same too.
Can't have that, man. Not today.
And if they say the word triggered, just turn it off. That's a pretty good key to live by too.
Yeah. Well, you kind of foreshadowed just a minute ago because you said his position kind of came from a place of care. So, segue?
Yeah, it's a good one. So on the main segment today, we're going to be talking about a pretty infamous essay in moral development and moral psychology and ethics called Moral Orientation and Moral Development by Gilligan from 1987. And this is basically considered one of the foundational papers in what's called care ethics. And this is not a domain that I'm an expert in, so I don't want to speak too much at length about the history of this whole orientation. But basically, from what I gather, care ethics is a sort of orthogonal to feminist theory and ethics, kind of detailing out how moral philosophy in America during the mid-20th century was very focused on issues of justice, not just politically, but also just in terms of ethics proper. And that there's a sort of a huge branch of moral psychology and moral development that whole orientation leaves out. And that is the issues of care and dependence and attachment and relationship. And so Carol Gilligan wrote this paper. I think she trained under, maybe it was Kohlberg, one of the famous moral development theorists.
Yeah, it was him.
And saw the influence of this whole orientation. I don't know if we need to go too much into that area because it's not something I know a whole lot about or I'm terribly interested in. But she wrote this paper as a way of saying that you can look at the data regarding moral development in men and women and see that there's actually some interesting differences between men and women, which is often glossed over since a lot of kind of mid-century moral development experiments were done solely on men and then extrapolated universally from there. Funny how that ends up like twisting the results, right?
Right. Yeah. Well, so I don't want to I'm not an expert in this either, in terms of like the history and shit like that. So, but I do know that she was working as a research assistant with Kohlberg. And so the one thing I did want to say is, so his theory of moral development has 6 stages, and its highest stage, and I'm going to read a quote here, that at its highest stage, an individual develops a deeply held, self-defined set of moral principles that one wishes apply equally to all. So kind of like universal, categorical imperative kind of thing. You reach that highest stage.
Yeah, you see the Kantian lineage there.
Yes.
Which was kind of new for the mid-century. That was kind of responding to the more expressivist and motivist tendency of previous moral psychology, where everything was really about feelings and emotions and not necessarily about sort of these rational or cognitive issues.
And what Kohlberg does is he ties that to a type of stage of almost biological and lived development, and that you can reach this 6th stage. And he says that not everyone will reach the 6th stage of moral development, though. And then what he tended to find out in his empirical evidence is that women tended to score at lower stages of moral development, that they didn't reach that 6th stage. So the implication is that women, under this rubric of reaching that 6th stage, were somehow inherently deficient. So Gilligan says, okay, there's something wrong about this, based on 1, his samples, 2, the orientation, the approach. Maybe you're front-loading everything by saying you have to fit yourselves within this 6-fold path. And so that was kind of one of the things that I think she used as a catalyst for her early research in like the late 70s into the 80s and stuff like that. So I just wanted to say that really quickly as well.
Yeah, and she's got a lot of work on this, which is, I think, really well balanced. Gilligan is not like a sort of like the stereotype from like the right of a feminist who's basically destroy all men's work and everything to do with masculinity, and then replace it with like the feminine monarch, right? Like the Amazonian woman. There's no sense of that here. It's extremely balanced, and in fact, doesn't really consider anything in the sort of what she calls the justice perspective to necessarily be wrong, or really challenges Kohlberg's sort of linear development through those stages as being necessarily wrong, but just very much incomplete, really halfway incomplete.
There's kind of, and I'm going to use this word lightly, and tell me if I'm wrong, there's kind of like a positional relativism, right? And a perspectivalism, which she clearly speaks about perspective here, where it's when you are viewing the world from within your perspective, it leads to different forms of rationality about ethics. And that there is a kind of male perspective that leads to a type of male-inflected justice, or a male-inflected ethic, which is based on the ethics of justice. And then simultaneously, or I guess contra to that, there's a female experience in the world, which tends towards, not an absolute, but tends towards this other element that is a little bit neglected in the opposite position, and it tends towards an ethics of care. And it seems that there's kind of a positional relativism, but then there's also kind of an essentialism here, which is an interesting juxtaposition or set of things to think through. Am I missing something, you think, or is that about right?
No, I think you're right. Just really quick, I want to say she's pretty careful not to associate these things with male and female. Right?
Man and woman?
Or even man and woman. It's the sense that men tend to be more oriented towards the justice perspective, and women tend to be actually split between the care and the justice perspective. So it's just that women tend to use the care perspective more than men do, is really how she puts it. It's certainly
so it's not like a biological essentiality.
Yeah, she's really clear about making sure it's definitely not a biological essentiality. I think she explicitly states that somewhere in the paper.
It's like a developmental tendency.
Yeah, so I think it leaves open the idea, or maybe even strongly implies the idea, that there's some sort of social engineering going on to sort of influence men to move more towards the justice perspective, and opens up the opportunity for women to use the care perspective, even though the women are certainly not really dominant on either. It's a little bit more split. We should talk a little bit about this justice and care perspective and how they differ before we move on. I use the term positional relativism. I think that's really good because she uses the notion of the Gestalt, which is sort of like switching entire perspectives on a thing such that there are no sort of qualitative similarities between the two perspectives you might have on a thing. And the classic example of that, as we know, and she uses it, is the duck rabbit, right? If you don't know what the duck rabbit is, literally just Google duck rabbit right now, look in Google Images, see the image. It's one image, right? But you can switch between two perspectives on it such that one is a duck and one is a rabbit. And you can't see both at the same time. That's the key, right? It's one or the other, and it cannot be both at the same time. And so she uses that as the ultimate explanatory analogy for the justice and the care perspectives, where you can look at moral problems and moral dilemmas from a justice perspective, where you ask the question, what is just in this scenario? And it usually revolves around equality, equality of rights, especially if used the individual person from an independence perspective, where they aren't, where they're an independent person considering what they need to do, or what they are due by others. It usually concerns the negative duties, like what you shouldn't do to other people, more so than the positive duties of what you should and shouldn't do, what you actually should do. And that is contrasted with the care perspective, which focuses more on the question, she says, how I should respond in a scenario. It assumes that your dependence, interdependence with other people, first and foremost, not just an independent person. It's really concerned with not abandoning people. Abandonment or detachment is kind of considered like the worst possible thing that can happen. And it's much more feeling-centered, emotion-centered, consider those things to be reasons for action. And it's more concerned with the positive duties about what you should do for someone and what people should do for you.
Can I ask you a question? Because I found this to be the most intriguing, quick little pithy bit of this, and it's earlier on. It's for people curious too. Hold on, let me make sure I don't lose my spot here. Okay, for people curious, the title of the article that we read is called "Moral Orientation and Moral Development." Did we already say that? Just so that.
Yeah, I did.
Okay, sorry. Yeah. So you can find it online, open access too. So I would recommend that you can check it out. But on page 5, at the top, it's really this quick thing. She says, the shift in moral perspective is manifest by a change in the moral question from what is just to how to respond. And I found that to be really interesting. Can you expand on like how to really flesh out that difference? Like, what does it really mean when one perspective is concerned with what is just? Is that more abstract? Is it more kind of attached to a Platonic legacy? I know you just said that one is more about like feelings and emotions, but I was wondering if we could unpack this a little bit more metaphysically even. Like, is there like a collapse of metaphysics in how to respond, and then it becomes a more like flattened, immanent ontology because it's more relational rather than vertical? Like, what's going on here?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think the issue of what's the ultimate question in ethics is really fun because it's not just about sort of how do you start doing ethics, although it is about that, and that's certainly important. It's also about anytime you're asking different questions, in ethics, you have to then ask, how does this connect to the fundamental question, right? And so if the fundamental question is what is just, that's going to be a universalist answer, right? But by its very nature, it has universalist implications. What is just is going to be just always and for everyone, right?
Yeah.
Whereas how to respond, one assumes interdependence, which is super important, right? Which the first question does not assume at all. But it does not assume universality. It doesn't assume that how you respond is going to be the same every time, even in the same scenario. It doesn't mean it's going to be the same for one person and another, even if they're in the same scenario or in very similar scenarios. So you have a lot of those implications already in the question. So I think it's a really interesting way of couching the idea, which is important because especially in ethics, this is how these dilemmas and questions come up, right? When we have to ask ourselves the question because we don't know the answer.
So I think that, yes, and it's interesting. I think the phrasing of these two little clauses is so interesting to me, and I don't want to put like too much stock in maybe these kind of juxtaposed 3-word phrases, but what is just is counterposed with how to respond. It isn't what should I do or what should we do, which again appeals, I think, to a pre-established sense of justice, right? But when you simply say how to respond, it seems very processual to me, right? Whereas some people,
how is very different than what?
Exactly. Right? Yeah.
It's not a thing or a state of affairs or a description necessarily, right? It kind of opens up the idea of the actions embedded in the answer, where it's not in what is just.
Do you think that when you ask how to respond, that there isn't already a pre-existent or like nascent, undeveloped, germinal sense of justice? Like you never are completely blank slated when you think even how to respond. You kind of have maybe uninformed or underdeveloped or maybe even misinformed conceptions of justice that will inform how to respond. But then the idea of how to respond from within the ethics of care opens you up to being aware of how those nascent forms of justice are just that they are nascent, they are underdeveloped, or they are conditioned under different logics or something like that. And so the important thing is to attune yourself to this interdependency so that you can redefine and restructure those pre-existent conceptions of justice that you might have.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. In the same sense that, kind of analogously, we often say if someone says they don't have a metaphysics because they want to get away from the idea of talking about metaphysics and just get to the real things or whatever, they just have a bad metaphysics, right? An undeveloped right. Metaphysics. In the same sense, if you're trying to do an ethics but you have no notion of justice behind it, you might just have a bad notion of justice behind it, right?
And or like a dogmatic notion of justice, even
an unreflective dogmatic one, yeah. And I think Gilligan's actually at least somewhat aware of this idea, right? She says at some point that both these perspectives have good foci that are helpful, and they also have points of where they can err pretty easily. So justice, she says, errs when it's by itself, when it sort of considers its own perspective to be objective truth and assumes everyone else is just like that, right? It gets a little too arrogant in its sort of universality, and ignores things like exceptions and stuff like that, and perspectives. But then also care can err as well. When she says something like the subject can become selfless and lose their own agency in the care. Ooh. Which I think is kind of an interesting thing to think about. But then also, I think she mentions this once, but I think it's really important to point out, and it's ultimately where I think the care ethics idea, as great as it is and as necessary as it is, can ultimately fall short a bit, is that you can care for the wrong things. That's certainly a possibility. And even care for things that end up being wrong to yourself as well. And care ethics, I think, doesn't necessarily give you all the means through which you can figure out when you care for the wrong things. We've talked before about Paul Bloom's against empathy, right?
Yeah.
And we have some qualms with that idea. Yeah. I have some qualms with his argument, but I think the basic idea that empathy cannot be the sole ground of a moral philosophy is correct, because we often empathize and care about the wrong things. We're biased towards people who are similar to us and against people who aren't. And so we need something like a universalized justice, something like that kind of perspective to help us figure out when we're being biased and how to correct that, right? And I think Gilligan's great at saying we need both perspectives. And that's, I just think, one really important reason why.
Yeah, she's not saying, Kohlberg, you're a fucking idiot, and people who are in pursuit of justice, you guys are just completely wrong. It's kind of like, well, hey, there's like a duality here, right? Your perspective is overly what we might call the masculine logic, let's say. And I mean that not in the sense of like male biological essentialism, but this tendential logic that has been associated with maybe, let's say, a masculine orientation in the world. And she's like, but you have to remember that there are these other people that we need to consider when we're doing these case studies. And she's a psychologist, so she's using a lot of data sets and empirical evidence and case studies and whatnot as her foothold. And she's realizing that most of these subjects that were in these previous studies are all just white dudes, right? And she's like, hold on a second here. We have these other people that need to be considered. So she's like, we need to kind of flesh out our perspectives. I was wondering, though, with that said, how much would this change if you, and I'm sure that there is research into like 21st century care ethics. But how does this change in 2019, let's say 2020, when taking in the trans experience, the black female experience, the black gender differentiations, various, even let's say a biological male, but someone who's raised by women in a culture that isn't like a hypermasculine culture or something like that. Like, this seems to be just a very muddy, not in a bad way, but just a very complex field that is really rich for study. But I wonder if there's anything that kind of like expands on this that you are familiar with that I just don't know about.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I'm not familiar with the recent research that gets into those very different experiences, but you can kind of see where that would go, right? At least as Gilligan has sort of pronounced here, if we have that kind of social aspect of sort of inculcating and initiating boys largely into the justice perspective and girls kind of in between the care and the justice perspective and opening up more opportunities for the care perspective, that would mean the more, quote unquote, intersectional that you get, the more sort of varied those things can be, right?
Yeah.
And the overlap can be sort of interesting. I do, and we're kind of moving back and forth between the descriptive and the normative here, which is, I think, important to point out. This article is largely descriptive, right? Talking about moral development and the orientations people have towards moral questions and concerns, and we're kind of moving back and forth between that and the normative. That's fine. I think that's appropriate given the circumstances.
Well, she's a psychologist. We're philosophers, so
yeah. So we're going to do that. We do that naturally, as long as we point it out. It's totally fine, right?
Yeah, exactly.
But yeah, I think that that's super interesting. And, why don't we talk about some of the actual cases here, because they're kind of fun to talk about. And I think as like quality radio, that's probably better than
cool
too much of this philosophy stuff.
Cool.
So one of the cases that I thought was really interesting, what to kind of illuminate what this justice perspective is and how it's different from the care perspective, was the religious disagreement example. And so the justice perspective was sort of the example of that was from a boy who disagreed with his parents about his religious preferences and beliefs, and couched the sort of moral nature of the problem in terms of his parents needing to respect his beliefs, that he has a right to them because he's an independent person who gets to have his own beliefs, right? Whereas the girl in the study said that her parents ought to listen to her and tried to understand her perspective. And so you see there the difference between respecting a belief and how that comes from the more justice perspective, right? It's what you're due from somebody else. And that being the assumption of independence existing there, right? Like, I have my own independent beliefs, and that's why they should be respected, because they're my independent beliefs. Whereas the care perspective comes from the girl saying something like, my parents have a duty, right? They ought to listen to me. They ought to do this relational action, right? And then understand my point of view, right? So it's not just that you should do this action, but you should like be in a state of relation to me, of understanding my perspective. It's subtle, but it's clearly different, right?
Yeah. So I've been thinking a lot about the issue of like quantitative analytical rationality in relation to like Lacan and male sexuation versus feminine sexuation, and then also kind of trying to tie that back into like notions of qualitative understandings of the world. I read this book, and I've been thinking a lot about this guy named Rene Guénon, who wrote a book called The Reign of Quantity, and I've just been thinking a lot about like eye for an eye, justice, types of orientations, and thinking about them as being essentially these like mathematical, quantitative, extensionally quantitative types of approaches. And I was thinking a lot about this as well, that this idea of like, I am due respect is kind of a tit for tat, quid pro quo, one for one type of orientation. Whereas the other, that that you ought to listen to me, isn't opposed to any sort of like quantitative, like that there is a quid pro quo or a relational thing, but it isn't pre-established that there is a one for one easily analyzable quantitative logic there, that you get more into a different type of quantitativity, which I would call intentional in Deleuzean terms. So if people understand that, then you can kind of look into that. Or maybe even veering into like a sort of qualitative relational ethic. And I think that there's something going on there in that division when you think about like, because I think about this a lot with like my dad. Like, what do I want with my dad? Like one of my frustrations with my father, or in my relationship with my father, is that I feel like sometimes I don't tell him things that are going on in my life, or I don't share certain bits of news because I just, whether rightly or wrongly, we can set that aside for a second, but I anticipate the criticism because it's not going to be good enough, because it's not me, worshiping Jesus or spreading the gospel in the way that he understands it from his like reformed Calvinistic perspective, right? So it's like, yeah, I've got a movie that's potentially playing at one of the largest film festivals in the entire world next year, but that doesn't matter as much because it's not like, where's the Bible in it, right? Or, I've written a book. Well, where's the Bible in it? And it's like, so I know that it just doesn't fit. And so I'm trying to think like, what do I want from my dad? Do I want respect, or is there some sort of relational thing that I just want him to fucking listen? And it was so interesting because when I was going through my surgery, my mom was here. She flew out for my surgery and then she helped me with the immediate post-op recovery, right? And like, sometimes I don't even care what comes out of my mom's mouth when I tell her something. It's just that she responds with support and care. And then I cry because I'm like, I love you so much because you care. Does that make sense? Like, it's just the fact that she's there and that she cares and that she's my social safety net that makes me cry. She could be saying, and then pat me on the head and I'm going to cry because I'm like, oh my God, you love me. So I almost feel like that's different than saying like, I want her to be like, yes, you are right. Or yes, your position is good, which I think would be more of like that one-to-one thing in this case study of like the boy, whereas I feel like I'm almost exhibiting more of that, like what the girl's perspective was, but I don't know, maybe that's not entirely true. I'm kind of flapping about now, but yeah.
No, I think that's right, because the wanting someone to listen and understand assumes you have a relationship with that person, right? That's already embedded in the idea. You don't want somebody who's a stranger on the street to listen and understand, right? Why would you if you don't know who they are? But you might want them to respect you in the sense of they're not going to rob you because they respect your humanity or whatever, right? So, the obvious difference there is the care perspective assumes interdependence. And so the relationship you have with someone kind of dictates and determines in a strong sense what the moral relations should be between you. And so, I think that's exactly right. And that's why, I think it's very common for people to have a relationship with especially boys, have a relationship with their father where respect is the dominant relationship or relation. And with the mother, it's this more, care-oriented relation. And sometimes that can be bad on both counts, right? But I don't know if they ever do any actual research where they talk about like interfamily dynamics exhibiting these kind of perspectives. But it seems like it's already there in this religious disagreement example, right? Using the family dynamic as the sort of the locus of these two perspectives.
That's really interesting, because so for background for people listening, the reason that Troy recommended that we read this article is I reached out to him and I said, I've been thinking a lot about just the issue of care and concern. It's something that comes up a lot in political ecology, environmental issues, things like that, especially now more recently, but also even in kind of like critical political economy and things like that, where people are trying to think through how it is that we can understand the effects of like financialized logics in the household and things like that. Does that affect relations of care and things like that? Do we just become like purely homo economicus type of subjects where everything is just an economic transaction, even at the dinner table, right? And so there's a lot of people that are doing work on trying to introduce care and concern as a category that's integral to understanding social, economic, political, ecological concerns. And I've been thinking a lot about the environment. And I've been thinking a lot about our thrownness into the world and ecological predicaments and things like that. which I think kind of relate to this. But I wonder.
And you keep using Heideggerian terms like surrogate, and I want nothing to do with that shit. So I'm bringing in the analytic moral philosophy. Here we go.
Okay, so help us out. I'll walk off the path, and you bring us back. But how can we take this similar thing? And I know that we're jumping off the case studies now and the examples, but let's look at the environment. And is there a sense in which, like you're saying, like the person that comes up, and I'm totally using analogies here, and I hope it doesn't get too confusing. But so the person coming up to you on the street, you don't want them to rob you. Is there a sense in which there's kind of an economic relation, a socio-economic relationship there? I do this for you, you do this for me, or I don't do this to you, you don't do this for me, right? Sort of thing. And that's maybe different from the interpersonal relational experience that you have with someone that you have a trusting relationship with, like the experience that I talked about with my mom earlier, which isn't as transactional. And is there a sense in which we can kind of like map that onto our relationship to the ecosystem or ecosystems in which we find ourselves? That there is a sense in which there's a transactional, like I'm going to take from the earth a particular thing so that I can make a certain thing. And then of course we obviously give back in terms of like we expel oxygen and, our skin cells are falling off. So there's always a sense in which there's a reciprocity, but there's a sense in which we can kind of like more consciously attune ourselves not to this type of transactional relationship where we're extracting for economic purposes, but that rather we can kind of like attune ourselves to a more care relationship where we find ourselves interrelated to ecosystems and elements within ecosystems.
Yeah, so I'm not positive that I'm following where you're going with that, but correct me if I'm going off track here, but okay. And this kind of gets to the ultimate question I wanted to ask you about this, and which is basically, do you think that Gilligan is right that these two perspectives are, I don't know if the term is mutually exclusive, but if they're gestalt, like they have to be one or the other at a time, if they can't be integrated, is basically the idea she kind of removes from the equation. That seems really unsatisfying to me. I read that and I'm like, no way, man. I'm gonna try to integrate them because the care perspective seems like an obvious remedy to the weaknesses of the justice perspective, but then vice versa also. It does seem like there's a sense in which if your relationship is with your mother is purely this one of care, that could end up being parasitic in a way, and that if your relationship is purely based upon justice, then you're obviously missing out on the whole idea of relationship in the first place, right? So there's some sense, and you mentioned the person on the street, right? So the justice perspective probably dominates the relationship with the person on the street more than someone because clearly you don't have much of a relationship with them, but you have some, right? Yeah. If they fell down as if struck by lightning, like having a heart attack or something, it wouldn't just be because you owe them something as a citizen of your country that you should help them. There should be some sense of like that you care about this person because they're suffering, and people suffering is something you should care about, right? Not just because of some abstract philosophical sense in which those who suffer are due moral consideration, but because you actually care in some sense, right? Or maybe the caring flows from some sense in which you think that they deserve moral consideration. I don't know how that works exactly, but there's going to be care there, and there should be. Like this seems like normative in that sense. And maybe that even extends beyond just humans, right? Maybe that extends to everything that we're interdependent with, which of course would be everything. So then it extends to the extension of that is, all that exists. And so I think that there's some sense in which these two perspectives have to be inclusive, right? And have to be married. But I don't know exactly how that cashes out, either in terms of orientation and the descriptive sense that a psychologist is going to talk about, or just in the purely moral philosophy sense, a theoretical sense, how we can involve care and justice together in ways where they actually help each other out.
Yeah, I've actually had people, like even in the Christian world, where like I went through a phase where, I guess I'm still kind of in that phase, but this kind of like universalist, like no, we shouldn't just only love the local church, or we shouldn't just only prioritize the nuclear family, but the same amount of love that we have for the local church, we should try to extend to our neighbor, to the other. And so it's almost like a universalization of the care disposition, so that the stranger on the street becomes just as important as, your elders or your children or something like that. And I've had Christian people tell me, no, that's not how it works. It can't work that way. And it shouldn't be that way. But that there is like a hierarchy of priority that matters. And I think that there's something interesting about that tension there. And I wonder if one is almost a default setting, which is what I think the position that respondent is then legitimating and valorizing to the hilt, right? That they're saying like, no, I'm limited, therefore I'm going to legitimate this limitation with a religious doctrine. Whereas what I'm wondering is okay, is that not like kind of like a de facto because of whatever certain social, maybe even biological, existential limitations, but that rather we can kind of war with that towards this universalist care perspective, and that we can learn to care for the stranger on the street, and then we can try to do that as well with, and I don't just mean trees, like let's hug trees because they're humans too, like you see those funny viral videos of people crying when, you know, trees are being deforested or something like that. I'm not talking about that. But there is something interesting in the cry of the environmentalists who are crying about the tree. The fact that they sincerely feel that pain is something that I kind of admire, because I don't feel that. And I wonder what it's like to care so much about a non-human entity, right, in the world. Or just to care in general. Like, I think growing up in the suburbs taught me to be nonchalant about shit, like as being a white middle class yuppie, like because that's cool. Because
everything's
it's easy
ironic,
yeah, everything's ironic. It's easy to attract chicks when you're at a bar and you're not trying too hard. Like the motto that my friends and I always used was from the movie Swingers: "Act like you don't need the shit, you get the shit for free." You know, like that kind of stuff. So to actually care about things is something that really matters to me. And I thought about this a lot when I was in the hospital, like looking at people who fucking cared for each other. And it was amazing for me, and it really was emotionally impactful, and it made me start to critically engage myself and think about, well, how can I care more? Not just about humans, but how can I care about the world, the earth? And I think some people that know me would be like, no, dude, you're not nonchalant. You do care. And yeah, sometimes, but sometimes I don't. And then a lot of times I am disattached. And a lot of times I think when I get to that point, when I care to the point where it makes me feel vulnerable because I'm exposed in my caring of the other, that's when I become nonchalant. And then I cut myself off and I take myself to that limit until I am exposed. And then I say, nah, I don't really care. And then I kind of insulate myself into my own individuality. And I wonder if there isn't a sense in which that the care ethic perspective challenges that tendency to retreat back into my insularity and continues to just open myself and disrupt myself towards the otherness of the other, that other being not just a human, but everything, you know?
Yeah, it seems like especially educated white males in 21st century America are so up their own ass 6 different ways that it's hard to even embrace the idea of care. Like, how do you care about a thing without having 4 different ironic dispositions relative to each other, to like distancing you from the thing you care about, the object of care, right? But then it's not hard, and this is maybe just like purely stereotypical from movies I've seen, but it's not hard to think about someone who does care about the trees from an authentic perspective, because they have some like ontology of the trees in which the tree actually has some sort of significance, right? And so that is not hard to. So even if you see like the educated white liberal who's crying because trees are being cut down, you look at that and you just kind of like scoff or whatever. Maybe not. I don't know. Maybe that's too ironic. Maybe that's appropriate. Whatever. But it's certainly possible, and certainly you think some people have cared about, animate but non-sentient beings, like trees or whatever, and that can authentically be done. And so you have to ask the question: what do they have that I don't? And maybe they're right. And so, and I think that you might find in that investigation that there's some sense in which those people think that it's just to treat trees with respect, and that the care flows from that, right? So that these 2 approaches can be symbiotic in a way, where justice sort of constrains care, and care sort of executes the demands of justice. And that's like super vague and ambiguous, and
maybe even challenges the confines of justice.
In what sense?
It doesn't just execute justice, but it also challenges how the dictates or how the principles of justice themselves are formulated.
Yeah,
right?
and how they're executed, because a big part of the
and how they're
is
executed.
exceptions.
Yeah.
Is a big part of that's exceptions, understanding other people's perspectives, which justice really tries to erase. Right? You think of like the Rawlsian original position, right? It just gets rid of all perspectives, and all particularities and differences, which is an important thing to do in some respects, right? But then it leaves a lot out that's super important, and so it's. I want to believe these two things are more symbiotic than like Gestalt switches, but
so how do you listen to the environment then without so here's one of the things I've been thinking about. I feel like a lot of you have like the pure economic perspective, let's say the extractive capitalist perspective, right? Which is that the environment is just there to benefit our own selfish pursuits, which I don't know how limited that is. I don't know how unconscious and just purely structural that is, but whatever, let's say that. Then you have more of kind of like the liberal, like, no, you have environmental economics. It's like, no, we need to treat the environment justly and fairly. So we can extract certain things, but within reason, because we understand scientifically that we can't disrupt certain balances within certain ecosystems or whatever, right?
Is that but nevertheless, for the sake of human survival and flourishing?
Yeah, for the most part, let's say, right?
Yeah.
But it still uses an economic logic, right? It still, divides the earth up into like quantifiable bits and tries to put a price onto the environment. And then you have maybe a little bit more radical, which is like political ecology or like steady state stuff, which tries to be like, no, let's live like degrowth lives, sustainable lives. Herman Daly is probably the big figure in steady state economics for that. And then you have like more radical, like, no, we need to decolonize, decarbonization, anti-capitalist perspectives. But I wonder, even within most of those kind of more progressive liberal ideas, as we're moving towards more of a perception of caring for the world, are they not still oftentimes tied to a logic of justice, and that there wouldn't be and this is kind of what I was getting at earlier, it wouldn't be a stronger position if we kind of put the idea of a care ethic at the forefront of even those radical orientations. Like, let's say if we're moving down the spectrum from the degrowth steady state stuff over more towards the radical positions, and then we infuse care ethics towards the world, towards the earth, towards our placedness within the world. If we put that at the forefront of our socio-political or political ecological orientation. And this is where somebody like Donna Haraway comes in. And I think we talked about this a few episodes ago with this idea of sympoiesis is what she calls it, which I think fits really well into a type of care ethic.
The interdependence idea, yeah.
Yeah. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that the issue would just be, I don't think most people do think that they're interdependent with the environment in any important way. It seems like the idea of nature as a human tool, simply of use value, is just really embedded, especially in Western capitalist democracies and in their culture.
But even Marxists,
it isn't necessary, but
yeah. No, but even Marxists, they kind of stop at a limit where they want to eschew exchange value, but to replace it with use value. And I think even that still is limited, right?
Oh yeah, it's not just capitalism that does this. So yeah, it's almost any anthropocentric approach. I mean, I think by definition, anthropocentric approaches are going to be ones that don't foreground interdependence with the environment. And it's really, especially from an ethical point of view, because ethics, by its very nature, assumes human superiority in some way. It seems like, because it's asking what should humans do, right? Which means that we have some sort of agency, which nature doesn't have. And so there's some implicit, subtle human superiority there. So it's like the question is really, how do you not be anthropocentric? That's super tough, man. I have no idea how you'd even approach changing the very investigative conditions of an environmental ethic. Does that make sense, what I'm getting at?
Totally. I mean, I think, especially socially, politically, ethically, personally, how do you shift that disposition is so hard. Individually, it's hard, let alone within your family, within your city, within your economic system, within your political structures, and then talk about global, transnational communities. to change the tide of our like collective rational orientation in the world seems like it would require a god, literally, right? Like
maybe the Heidegger back again. Only a god can save us.
I know I was going to say that, but no, really, like it does seem like that. But you know what I'm thinking? I'm thinking of Sergei Prozorov. And do you remember at the end of Void Universalism 1, when he starts talking about, he says, I don't know how we could use this investigation towards that end, but by understanding this ontology of the void, we have to realize that this is not an anthropocentric philosophical position, but rather the non-human becomes integral to this because the void is a universal principle. So it's not just universal politics or global politics, but rather it has to be a sort of total universal ontology of everything, right?
And Prozorov's program was a justice perspective, if there ever was one. It's very much descriptive and universalistic. So I think that the fact that even the three principles, right, equality, freedom, and community, right, notice two of those are the Rawlsian principles of justice, right?
Because they come out of the French Revolution kind of idea, right? Fraternity, egalitarian.
Equality and liberty are the principles of justice for the Rawlsian position, right? Leaving out community, the very one which talks about interdependence. And so that could just be bullshit, but I just thought that was like an obvious, important addition to the Prozorov justice format, basically, including interdependence or community. Which maybe says a little bit more about this idea that interdependence, community, fraternity, care can all have a symbiotic relationship with the justice perspective. Maybe that's possible. It certainly isn't active right now in our sort of social and political imagination, but it's gonna have to be. Otherwise, we're gonna fuck all this shit up.
Do you think that this set of concerns is exclusively or maybe just primarily or mostly a Western concern, and that if we look to Eastern philosophy, African philosophy, Aboriginal philosophy here in Australia, etc., that we find like already a care ethic or something that would be maybe like some sort of productive, I don't know, bedfellow with a care ethic that we can glean from? Is this like primarily a concern of like post-Western or maybe even like post-Renaissance kind of European malaise?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to go so far as to say like, Enlightenment, Western rationalism is like the cause of this whole problem. Even if it largely is, it's certainly not the only culture in history which has use and abuse the environment. But it certainly seems like if you want to get an example of it, you're going to have to go elsewhere. And as I was saying before, like it seems obvious that there's some cultures in history that have done much better at this, right? With regarding interdependence with the environment and creating the symbiosis between justice and care with that respect. So yeah, I mean, do you have any ideas about where that might be found?
Well, I mean, I before I do that, I will say there does tend to be a sort of, and maybe this is kind of a Western liberal, almost like a paternalistic, like, what is the phrase? Not the beautiful savage, noble savage kind of perspective on like Native Americans, for example. Like, oh, we just need to listen to indigenous people because they actually have always cared about the environment. They've always been sustainable.
Like, that's somewhat true.
And it is, yeah. Right. But how do we glean from, like, I've been reading a little bit of Russell Means, who's a Native American or American and Indian writer. He actually likes the word Indian, but American Indian writer. And he talks a little bit about stuff like this. And yeah, like, it is a little bit true, but how do we listen to Russell Means? How do we listen to the First Nations people here in Australia? How do we listen to Hindu philosophy? How do we listen to African, the history of African philosophies that are not colonized. And I think that's why, so I'm a part of a climate justice collective here, and one of the things that really concerns a lot of the activists within that group is decolonization, right? Because they recognize that there's a colonial logic that is kind of embedded within our orientation to the environment, and so that we can try to scrape beneath that to get to a sort of like pre-colonial or post-colonial or whatever perspective that will help us to better attune ourselves, or let's say position ourselves within the world, attune ourselves to the world and then position ourselves within the world. But I wonder, sometimes it can come across as like paternalistic, and then like really, I don't know, like patting the good savages on the head and being like, oh, you know, you guys were good, but now we're going to take your ideas and we're still going to use them in the causes of industrialization or whatever, you know?
Well, that seems the key, right? If you use it for the cause of industrialization, then that's clearly like unethical. It's more about like literally listening, right? Listening and trying to learn from somebody else who does their shit better and as more of an adult than you do.
Right. I mean, that was one of the things that actually really impressed me with the climate strike that happened here in the last couple of weeks. The amount of indigenous voices that were actually at the forefront of the climate, at least here in Australia. I don't know how it was elsewhere, but at least here in Australia, it was pretty striking. Like I was pretty overwhelmed actually, and it's something that that we're constantly working through in our own group is making sure that we're not just a bunch of like educated white activists, but that we actually not just throw a token out there so that we can have the token indigenous representative, but rather actually truly, authentically experience the world from within a different framework, you know? And that's fucking hard.
Yeah, it's fucking hard, but it's super important.
Crucial.
Right? That's really the only way you learn. Otherwise, you're just navel gazing.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of what Gilligan is offering, right? It's that different perspective. It's that different position. It's that different orientation that is crucial to place as an integral component of your ethic in the world.
Yeah, and so even if you haven't done the brilliant, moral, philosophical move and integrated the perspectives, you can at least practice both of them. That's certainly like a practical, ethical change that you can make.
Well, cool. Well, I say we go ahead and wrap it up there. Yeah, man?
Yeah, that was fun. I'm glad we did that and then took it down an avenue that was not obviously related. I'm talking about the environmental ethical issues.
Yeah, and this is, she's one of the people that I've seen referenced a billion times, and I've seen the phrase care ethics referenced a billion times, and you hear about it in seminars all the time, but I've actually never read her. Well, that's not true. In like one of those like anthologies, I think I read like an excerpt of something previously too, but I don't really spend much time reading, obviously, analytic stuff, and I think this is kind of a crucial text within the analytic circles, so I'm glad I got to read it.
Yeah. All right, so let's move on to the Sticky Leaves segment of the show. This is where one of us talks about whatever it is that's giving us meaning in a potentially meaningless universe. So, Austin, I can't imagine anything's happened to you recently to provide with any meaning, so you should probably just skip this part of the show, right?
Yeah, it's impossible for me to even try to narrow this down to a single thing. I guess since we're going to do a bonus episode, we're going to talk about the K-hole experience, and then we're going to kind of talk about my time in the hospital a little bit. So I think I'll reserve the hospital stuff and post-hospital thoughts and things like that for the bonus episode. I know that might be unfair for people who want to hear it, but we'll just dedicate an entire episode to that, and then maybe down the future I can release that episode. There's that singular episode on the main thing, but it's just too much to talk about in like a 10-minute segment, right? So what I am going to talk about is something else that has given me meaning. So before I got sick, I actually had an appointment to get my tattoo finished up on my right arm, and I got sick on a Friday, and my appointment was for the following Thursday. And when I first got to the hospital, I didn't realize how severe the issue was, and I thought that like they would just have to give me some oxygen, it would reflate my lung, they'd give me like some oral steroids, maybe some inhalers, maybe it was like an asthma induced thing. I don't have asthma, but I don't know, maybe like an allergy induced asthma thing. And so I was like, oh, I'll be done, in a couple hours. And then they're like, oh, we're gonna keep you here overnight. And then I'm like, okay, well, cool, then I can leave tomorrow. And then it's like, no, you might have to be here a couple more days. And then it's like, oh, well, now we might have to do surgery. And then it's like, okay, how much longer am I going to stay? So it gets to be like Tuesday, and I find out that or Monday, and I find out I'm having surgery. And so I had to cancel my tattoo appointment. I was so bummed. So I told him, I'm like, I don't know when I'll be recovered, but I'll let you know when I'm able. And I may have rushed it, but I decided to get my tattoo done this week. And it's a half sleeve. So like I already have a half sleeve on my right arm that goes down to my elbow. And so this is like the rest of it, filling it out down to my wrist, actually beyond my wrist. It goes down to my hand. But I got the tattoo done 2 days ago. And I fucking love, and not only do I love the art, like I'm a little bit obsessed with it. I'm like a kid after Christmas when you get a new toy. And I literally woke up the day after I got the tattoo at like 5 a.m. and I just wanted to look at pictures and look at it in the mirror and shit like that. And then it was the same thing yesterday. I was so excited, and I fucking love it so much. So if people are interested in seeing it, you can. Oh, actually, it won't be on my Insta story anymore. But I tweeted about it, so you can go to my Twitter and you can see. I posted some photos of it. Or you can go to the tattoo artist. He's on Insta at Gordo. Gordo, and then it's Taub, Taub, so Gordotaub. He's a brilliant fucking tattoo artist, does some weird like abstract watercolor stuff, and my tattoo is the most recent post, but by the time this episode comes out, or by the time you listen, it might be later, but you'll see, just look through them. Anyway, I just fucking love the experience of the tattoo. That's the thing I want to talk about more. It's so strange because...
Of getting the tattoo?
Yeah, and that's what I wanted to talk about. Because, like, so we thought it was going to be 4 hours. That's what he thought. And when he told me 4 hours, I was like, I think that's quick, considering the amount of stuff I'm getting done. But he said 4 hours, and I was like, okay, dude, we'll see. Because it is kind of sparse, too, people will see. Even though it's a half sleeve, it's not, like, fully colored in all the way down, and it's black and gray. So, and it's kind of sparsely placed with some different elements. So, but I was like, are you sure? Well, it wasn't 4 hours. It was 7 hours. And that was about what I thought it would be. But and of course not working the entire time. Some of it's applying the stencil, making sure everything is spaced appropriately, bathroom breaks, food breaks. But I'd say it's about 5.5 to 6 hours of actual work, and it hurts, man. Like anyone who says it doesn't hurt, I think is full of shit. The question is can you deal with the pain? Like it's not comfortable. It's not like when you eat ice cream or have sex, which causes immediate joy. Like there's unless you're down with the painful, funky shit in sex, I'm just talking about pure orgasm. It feels good. When you eat ice cream, it feels good. This isn't that. It doesn't feel good. You have a needle going into your fucking skin. It hurts.
How much does it hurt? Like compared to what?
It depends on the part. I heard somebody once describe it as it's like having a sunburn and then having a cat scratch it.
For hours and hours?
For hours and hours. And I think sometimes it does feel like that. So certain parts, like the inner arm, like the inner bicep, from my previous tattoo, there's a lot of shading in there on mine. That hurts. Down towards the elbow hurts because it's just bone. The inner elbow, that little ditch area there, that's really sensitive skin. That hurts. The wrist really hurts. For me, actually, the wrist, I've got some pretty heavy shading in the wrist area. That hurt a lot for me. And then I'm also, I'm not like a huge dude, so I've also got like, there's not a lot of like skin or padding there. So it's like right on the bone. And you also feel the machine moving on your bone. So it's not just a skin thing. So that kind of hurts. The inner arm was really weird, like down the wrist, because, people cut themselves or like people commit suicide there. So it almost felt unnatural when he was tattooing that part of my arm because I got kind of creeped out because I was thinking about that shit. So that hurts. But then the other parts, it just sucks. Like, you're just kind of like, all right, dude, like, I get it now. It's been 4 hours. Cool. But then here's the weird thing. Like, I got really We both actually did. I got really like bummed when he was almost done. Like when I knew that it was the final couple of pieces that he was, or the elements that he was gonna work on. It was kind of like I was like, I didn't want the experience to end. There's this strange enjoyment that comes even when my arm hurts after being at this tattoo shop for 7 hours or 7+ hours. I got there at 11. I didn't leave until 7. But I just didn't want it to end. And I think him too, because I gave him so much creative artistic license that he had such an amazing time. Like he was so jazzed to do this. And we actually kind of have become friends through the process of like collaborating with ideas and coming up with sketches and stuff like that. But we're both like, man, I kind of don't want it to end. You know, it's like, okay, well, what else can you tattoo on me, dude? And so there's like this weird camaraderie, this weird relationship that kind of got built up, or that gets built up through the tattooing process, especially over a long duration. And I don't know, it's just kind of a strange experience. It kind of sounds weird, huh?
Well, yeah, this brings up the question then. If it's this enjoyable and this much of a meaningful experience, are you going to get more?
Oh, fuck yeah. Oh, yeah.
Where?
So, I mean, now I've got the sleeve on my right arm. I've got a piece on my side at the moment. But my plan when I first started my half sleeve on my right arm was always to finish the sleeve on that right arm. That just took me 10 years to come up with the idea and feel comfortable about what I wanted to do to finish the lower half of the arm. But the idea was always that would be themed based on John Milton's poem Il Penseroso, very loosely at least, and that the other arm was going to be dedicated to the sister poem to that, which is L'Allegro, which is the happy man. And so the idea is still always there. I want to do it. And I've actually found, I think, the basic ideas in rough form for what I want to do. So yeah, I will. It's so weird. You know, usually people think when you're young and you're dumb and you're in your 20s, you want to get like stupid tattoos and then you regret it later. I'm actually the opposite now. I'm in my 30s now, and now I'm like, I want to be covered, you know?
Well, I think there's a sea change happening, at least anecdotally, amongst people regarding tattoos. It's much more socially accepted now, especially amongst people who are actually in the like full-on middle age.
Yeah, it's not so much like a rebellious thing.
Yeah,
right?
It's definitely more of like a creative, expressivist kind of thing now.
Yeah, but I will say that part of it is a little bit rebellious for me. I mean, obviously, for people who have seen the tattoo or for people who don't know, the themes are all quite revolutionary, political, a little bit rebellious, somewhat in your face. You know, I've got a song lyric from one of my favorite songs by Rise Against that's with hope in our hearts and bricks in our hands, we sing for change. I also use that in the sort of preface of my book, and I talk about how this book is like my metaphorical brick. And so I've got some bricks on my arm that turn into a pen moving down my hand, because the idea is that my pen is my metaphorical brick. So rather than having literal bricks in my hands singing for change, it's the pen or my artistic output is the idea, right? So you have stuff like that. I've got like these figures on there that are inspired from some pictures from the protests, the student protests in Paris in May 68. There's like a Molotov cocktail with a flower growing out of it, so it's a little bit of like destruction but also creation in life at the same time. You know, there's L'imagination à pouvoir is written on my arm, which is again a great slogan from May 68 that was graffitied everywhere. So there's definitely like that rebellious element, but for me it's definitely more of a creative artistic thing, and the style is totally like street art. Right? So there's an aesthetic thing going on here, but it goes down to my hand, and that's generally referred to when you get it on your hand or on your neck. They call it the everlasting job stopper.
Because you can't cover it up?
Because you can't cover it up. And I had a bunch of my friends were like, dude, do you want to go down to the hand? Are you sure? And I'm like, if I made this decision in my like early 20s, which most people do, they get the neck tattoo or the hand tattoo in their 20s, and it's like, dude, are you sure? And they're like, yeah, man, it's cool, fucking don't care. But I'm in my mid 30s, you know? And I've been thinking about this shit for ages, right? So it's kind of like, fuck it, you know? So there is still a little bit of a rebelliousness, and actually post-hospital experience, I'm starting to become even more fuck it. Not fuck it like I'm just going to be this blatant asshole, but kind of like, I'm kind of going to start to just not I'm going to try at least even more so to not be so concerned about what social restrictions say or what social expectations impose upon me. And I'm kind of going to do my thing. And if I love it, I'm going to do it. And if I want to do it, I'm going to do it. And that's hard for me because I tend to be very, try to please everybody sort of thing. And I'm trying always to manage that balance. And part of getting the tattoo down my hand is a sort of like performative act to remind myself, well, fuck them, Well,
dude, getting a tattoo down your hand, and especially the ones that are very explicitly leftist and political, like the ones you have, right, means that you may never get a real quote job, but you'll always have the opportunity to sell your soul and become a right-wing hack control. Because having explicit leftist tattoos and then like making your hay as a person who converted from a leftist political orientation to the right wing makes you the most authentic right wing person that there is, right? Like they all want to have that, like, oh, I left the left, right? And so I'm proof that it's intellectually disingenuous or whatever, or pure virtue signaling. And so you could actually advertise at the best. You have an opportunity there always before you in case you ever need to sell out.
Are you saying I'm going to be like the next Gavin McInnes?
I'm just saying, if you need the money, man, if you need a life-saving operation and you're still in America and you don't have healthcare, you know what you can do for 6 months.
Oh, geez. I think a more plausible scenario is that when I start my home church in the mountains, I'm going to be a very authentic pastor because I'll be able to stand out there and I'll be like, I was rebellious and youthful in my 30s when I had a sort of late kind of punk phase. I think that's more plausible.
Yeah, you'll definitely be the old guy who has lots of stories.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, explaining your tattoos to your grandchildren, that's definitely something that I'll never experience.
You don't think you'll ever get one?
No.
No. Is it like just because you aesthetically aren't into them? Is it because you don't think you could come up with the idea? What is your resistance?
I'm aesthetically into them on other people.
Yeah.
Just don't have any desire to have one for myself, and also would regret instantly whatever I chose. And don't have enough of an artistic impulse to really do it anyway.
But you're such a music guy. And not only are you a music guy, you're into heavy music.
Yeah, you know the best part about music?
Yeah.
You can turn it off.
I know, but I just mean like the culture of music is so associated with tattoos, especially hard, heavy metal music, stuff that you're into, right?
But the issue is, and especially heavy music, is extremely bent on this like expressivist idea, where creation is about expression of one's inner self, and that I just think is one, I think either totally wrong or mostly wrong, and then also just not at all how I experience music and art generally. I don't have that expressivist orientation whatsoever. So yeah, that whole part of it's gone. And then you can have tattoos and not do it in an expressivist manner, certainly. But then I just don't have any other desire to have them anyway. I think it's awesome that some people do, and I think it's a really cool artistic choice, especially if done well, like yours are. But yeah, not for me.
I think you have a tattooed soul, Troy.
Yeah, man.
That's what it is.
A tattooed soul, which I change on a whim.
That's right. That's why you tattoo your soul, because it can constantly shift. Yeah.
That sounds like the worst Stone Temple Pilots song.
Tattooed soul? Yeah, that's like a total like emo hardcore band, right? Tattooed Soul. Oh my god. Oh Jesus. So yeah, that was it. And I thought that was kind of weird that like I actually was not expecting to almost feel a little melancholy at the end of the tattoo experience, because it hurts and your arm is swollen. And the good thing is my skin takes tattoos really well. Some people, they get really red, they get really swollen, they bleed. I don't. But nevertheless, there's always some redness and some swelling. But you're at the end of this, 7-hour session, and I'm sitting there, and he put the stencil on, and I could tell that he was on the second to last one. And then when he was on the last little portion, I was kind of like, man, this sucks. And he's like, I'm bummed that I'm done too. I'm like, I know. And I was not expecting that. I kind of just thought it would be, you know what? I thought it was going to be transactional, and it ended up kind of being a care experience in a weird way.
Do you think the fact that it hurts adds some significance to it in the sense of it kind of ends up being kind of like battle scars.
100%.
Like you earned this.
100%. Yeah, 100%.
If it didn't hurt, it wouldn't be anywhere near as significant.
100%. Yeah. So my tattoo artist, his name is Jose Carlos Jr. He's a Brazilian dude. And like I already told you, his Insta for people to go follow him. He's fucking amazing, honestly. He just got a tattoo on his neck recently. And, he's got tattoos all over, but this is his first neck tattoo. And he said it hurt so bad and the experience was so shitty that it's actually put him off on his plans for his other tattoos for a little bit, just because he needs to like regroup a little bit. But nevertheless, he's still doing it. So even him, a guy who's fully tatted up all over his body, he's a tattoo artist. He's not going to be one of those guys that's like, it doesn't hurt, man. Don't be a pussy kind of thing, right? He's like, no, it fucking hurts, man. It does. And in certain places, it hurts more. But there's something weird about experiencing that pain where you might need to take a breath and you might not need to rush back into the battlefield, quote unquote, so quickly. But nevertheless, you're still ready for the next trench, Yeah,
I get that. I think that's an important point. And we talked before on the podcast about how interesting it is that there's certain experiences which pain is kind of constitutive of the goodness of the experience. And that seems like an obvious example I'd never thought about before. But yeah, tattoos, if you remove the pain from the experience, it seems like they would actually lose significance rather than gain it.
Dude, my tattoo's not even healed. I'm literally on the third day right now. It's the morning of the third day, and I'm already thinking...
you just rose.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, maybe that's why I'm thinking about it. But I'm already thinking about what I want to do next. Like, my tattoo is still, it's a little dry and stiff and a tad sore in a couple of spots. And I'm already thinking, like, okay, I can't wait. Maybe next month I can go in and get this. So, like, it's weird. It is weird. But I love it. I do.
All right, sweet. Thanks for detailing out that experience.
Yeah, man. All right, let's go ahead and wrap up the episode there. It's good to be back. It's good to do this. We will be
good
consistent.
To have you back, man.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Thank you, of course, to the listeners for listening. Mubi, go get your free trial. Mubi.com/owlsatdawn. Patreon, if you can support us, it'll really help us to be able to consistently produce content, better content, etc. moving forward. Patreon.com/owlsatdawn. You can email us, you can tweet at us, you can Insta us, you can comment on shit on owlsatdawn.com, whatever. You know how to find us. And if you don't...
I'm pretty sure you can just Google owls.dawn at this point. All our stuff comes up, right?
Exactly, yeah. So, well, sweet, man. I think that's pretty much it, unless there's anything else you got to say.
Just one more thing I can think of, dude.
What's that, man?
Maybe I should get this tattoo. Das Vidania, Amerikanski.